Good morning and welcome to St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and it is my joy and delight to welcome you to the forum where each week we have sacred conversations about the subjects that matter. And today we're talking about a subject that I think is on a lot of people's mind, the subject of abortion rights and how they can be secured and how we can change minds on the subject. We are very honored to have with us Sarah Jones, who's a senior writer of New York Magazine and has written several different articles on the subject to talk about the issue with all of us. Thanks so much for being here, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here at such a crucial moment. And I'm looking forward to talking about this with you and hearing questions from the audience. I'll just start by explaining a little bit about the work that kind of brought me here today and explain a little bit about my own background as part of that because it does inform what I do at New York Magazine and has informed my coverage of abortion. So I'll just get right into it. But the short version is that I was raised very conservative, evangelical in Southern Appalachia, so very much the Bible Belt. My parents are very pro-life. I attended a very, very conservative Christian university where I think I could fairly describe it as a hotbed of anti-abortion activism. It was a very popular cause on campus. So I spent pretty much the first couple decades of my life really immersed in conservative politics, conservative religion, the fight against abortion, hearing that rhetoric, being surrounded by that rhetoric, only to then change my mind on the subject of abortion and many other subjects as well. And so when we first got the report of the leaked opinion in Dobbs, I started thinking about the way that I wanted to respond to that. I wasn't personally shocked by it because I had been so surrounded by the anti-abortion movement. I knew that this was a moment that had been decades in the making and was the product of a very well-funded, very well-organized, if minoritarian movement. But the path to addressing it specifically was a little bit fraught, and it took some time to think about it. And I realized what I really wanted to do is talk to other people who had changed their minds on the subject for a few reasons. One is I wanted to know if there was maybe a better, smarter way that we could be talking about abortion that would reach people where they were, that could maybe peel people off the anti-abortion movement and maybe tone that rhetoric down so it was less radical and more centered on what abortion means to the people who need it. In a broader sense, I've also always been interested in conversion, why people believe what they believe, how they come to believe it. And it seemed like an appropriate moment to reach out to people who had grown up similarly to me to hear their stories and write about that for New York. And I got a pretty overwhelming response actually when I put out a call for sources. It's difficult to quantify exactly how common this experience is, but again, pretty overwhelming response. Few people were the children of ministers who'd grown up in very conservative families where abortion was a pretty hot topic. And they all had slightly different answers to this question of how had they come to change their minds on on a subject that was of such importance to their families and to their churches as children. And what I found was, in most cases, it was a personal story that really reached them. They knew someone who had an abortion, and they knew that that person wasn't a murderer, wasn't a monster, was just a person who was in a moment of crisis and needed an abortion. One woman attended the same university I did, a few years behind me, and she unfortunately had a miscarriage, and she had to complete the miscarriage, and that, she felt some reluctance around that because she'd grown up around such strident anti-abortion rhetoric, and she started to ask herself, well, why do I feel this way when this is a life-saving procedure that I really need? So what I found is that personal story is really important, and it cuts through a lot of that rhetoric, and it does tone things down a little bit and makes things less radical, and it makes it much more difficult to see people on the other side of the abortion story as anything other than human, which I think is incredibly important. So for me, part of this journey was not just coming to a position on abortion where I realized it had to be legal, it was politically necessary, but I also came to see it as a moral good, as something that was pivotal to the liberation of women and anyone else who can become pregnant. And that's a pretty radical departure from the way I was raised, but it is where I'm at right now. And now that Dobbs is official, no longer a leak, but unfortunately the Supreme Court ruling and Roe is no more, I feel even more convinced that abortion is a moral good and something that we need to fight for in the years to come with as much passion as the anti-abortion movement has fought against it.
It strikes me that on this issue, and I know you've written a lot about abortion, you've also written a lot about other kinds of religion and political intersections, that you are both journalists but also the subject. You're very aware of your own circumstances that you bring to anything you're writing about. So can you talk about what it's like to be both studying yourself and others as you write about these topics?
Absolutely. I mean, religion was one of the first subjects I started writing about professionally, first as a freelance writer and then on staff at the New Republic and now New York Magazine. And it is so much because of my personal experiences. And in one sense, it's because I want to be transparent. Like, religion is a subject that's fascinated me while I was still an evangelical. In fact, I would argue that it's probably one of the reasons I'm no longer a conservative evangelical, because I was so interested in finding out what other people believed and why they believed it. So it came naturally to me to write about it, but at the same time, I felt I needed to be transparent about my own relationship to the subject, to sort of bring myself to the level of my sources as a character in my own story, not necessarily the main focus, because I don't think my story is necessarily more important than anyone else's, but as a voice in a chorus, I would say. I don't think my experiences are that unusual.
You write in this one particular article about the conversion that happens on this issue. How common is that for folks to change from a pro-life to pro-choice stance? And I also know that sometimes it happens in the reverse, most famously, of course, with Jane Roe herself, who changed her mind on the issues, it seems, several times during the course of her life after Roe versus Wade. Can you talk about the conversions that happen in the other direction as well?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, it is difficult to quantify exactly how common this is. We know that most Americans wanted Roe v. Wade to remain the law of the land, and if you look at the polling, the younger the generation, the more likely they are to be pro-choice. So that's what I mean when I say I think my experiences aren't all that unusual. It's difficult to say exactly how common they are, but I think you can extrapolate from the polling and just anecdotally from the response I got to the story that it's not all that unusual. But of course, there are these conversions that happen in the other direction, and I think belief is just fraught terrain in America, and there's so many competing pressures. With the advent of social media and the internet, it's a lot more common, a lot easier to encounter perspectives that are different from your own, and some people find that persuasive.
You've mentioned already the need for a moral argument for abortion. Can you share what exactly that argument is and why it's so important?
Right. I don't see abortion as something that's value neutral. I think very much of it in terms of liberation. I see feminism in particular as a movement that's centered on the collective liberation, not just of women, but against misogyny, against patriarchy, which is damaging for everybody, not just women. So abortion for me is really pivotal to that, and the right of a person to have an alternative to pregnancy, to not be forced to alter their body in a potentially permanent and life-threatening way is incredibly important. And I don't think women can be full citizens without the right to an abortion. I think the fall of Roe was not just damaging for the right to abortion in isolation, it was incredibly damaging for the notion of women's equal citizenship and freedom.
You criticize the left in some of your writing for hiding behind euphemism and equivocation. You talk about President Clinton's famous phrase, safe, legal, and rare, and you say maybe that's not how we should be talking about abortion. How should we be talking about abortion instead?
I don't think we need to necessarily mimic everything the anti-abortion movement does, especially considering that violence has been such a core part of the anti-abortion movement. But one thing I do think that the left can learn from that movement is that they're very open about their goals. They're not afraid to talk about abortion in the terms that they think are accurate, and I think it's important for the left to respond in kind, to not hide behind these euphemisms, to explain, first of all, what abortion is. There's so much misinformation about it, why it's important, and I don't think you can do that if you're hiding behind language like safe, legal, and rare.
And the Episcopal Church's official position on abortion is that it's kind of a regrettable tragedy, but we respect women's right to choose. That seems to be also an argument that you find issues with. That this was formulated years ago, so it doesn't necessarily reflect the opinions of most Episcopalians today. But I'm curious, why is it important for us to talk about abortion as something that is good rather than something that is a regrettable tragedy we have to live with?
I know a lot of people who have moral reservations about abortion. My own parents are obviously among them, although I will say that they support certain exemptions to anti-abortion law, which puts them to the left of most of the GOP at this point. So I'm familiar with that perspective. I have a lot of empathy for it because when I say that we should be talking about abortion in open terms and not hiding behind euphemism, I don't mean that we should be talking about it flippantly. I don't think, even when abortion isn't to the person who's deciding to have one, like the obvious choice, like there's nothing else that I'm going to do in this scenario, I'm going to have an abortion. That's not necessarily an easy decision. It's not necessarily without its moral weight. And I think you can talk about that without talking about abortion as a tragedy. I think we have to be careful about the language that we're using and about feeding into stigma surrounding abortion. So I guess, yes, I would take some issue with that perspective and with that language, but I do think you can hold that perspective and still come around to a position which I think is necessary and correct, which is that abortion needs to be legal. It needs to be available to people, and that's, to me, the most important bottom line.
One of the things that struck me so much about your article about the abortion converts is that in this hyper-polarized society, it seems less and less likely that people change their minds about anything. Any reflections on the kind of polarization of where we are as a society? I found out this week that we had a service after the Dobbs ruling as a kind of prayer and healing service, and that got on the radar of Breitbart, who has labeled us a woke church. How do we talk kind of responsibly about these issues when the environment of polarization seeks to get in the way of any kind of dialogue at all?
Right. No, dialogue is incredibly difficult right now. I mean, it's so heated, and this has been true of abortion in particular for so long. And I think that's a deliberate strategy of the right, is to make dialogue so difficult. When you're talking about abortion as murder, it becomes very difficult to have a reasonable conversation about it, in my view. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to write that article, is to figure out what conversations were effective. What were those conversations like? like what got through to somebody, what convinced them to change their mind. And I was really, again, struck by it so often being a personal story, by being like encouraging empathy on the part of another person, rather than just like, I'm going to logic you out of this. It was really that sense of like forming a human connection with another person that mattered and was important. And that is not what the Breitbarts of the world want. You know?
Well, and especially when so much of our arguments happen behind social media, et cetera,
Right.
we're not dealing with the flesh and blood of a person right in front of us and
Right.
their reality.
Right. It's very easy to fire off a tweet. I'm very guilty of this myself from time to time, especially, you know, in a heated moment. But I don't think we can lose, as someone who is emphatically on the left and considers themselves a leftist, I don't think we can give up on persuasion. It's such a core part of politics. And again, I don't think that necessarily means I'm going to, you know, beat you over the head with my position. I'm going to logic you out of your position. It reminds me almost of the way that kind of new atheists went about things, you know, fighting with creationists back in the 90s and the early 2000s, and it wasn't that effective. But I do think when I talk about persuasion, it really means like talking about things in human terms. Like, without the right to abortion, what does this mean for women? It's frightening. It makes you feel lesser. It makes you feel inferior. Makes you worried about the future. Talking about it in those terms, I think, has an impact and is the way we should be talking about it.
When you write about how arguments about abortion tend to be about abstractions, the fetus becomes an abstraction, and it's not about the real experience of the woman whose life is affected. Can you talk about how abstraction gets in the way of us having productive discussions?
Yeah, I think this is another strategy of the right, is to sort of move the conversation onto territory where they feel comfortable, and it is that abstraction. It's easier for them to talk about a person who isn't here yet, who isn't with us, who doesn't have life experiences that kind of brought them to this moment. It's a lot more difficult to reckon with the person who is pregnant, who is the one making this decision. You have to address them as a human being, as a complex and full human being, who might not be the easiest poster child for abortion rights or against it. You have to take them as they are, where they are. And that's not territory where the right feels comfortable, but I think it's where we need to be.
I think I read somewhere in your pieces that you said that pro-life activists don't really care about women and children. Is that accurate? And if so, tell us a little bit about that perspective.
It's a bit of a generalization. I would say I know a few anti-abortion activists who do believe in a consistent ethic of life, who do support an expanded welfare state, and who would argue that they care about children very much, but I don't think that that's necessarily a mainstream view within the anti-abortion movement. And I think that's pretty clear if you look at conservative states. Take the state of Mississippi with its exceptionally high maternal mortality rate, very few resources available for people who become pregnant, who are new mothers with children. I think the priorities at this point are pretty obvious and pretty clear. And I would argue that the priority is the subjugation of human beings and this sort of commitment to a hierarchy where women are not at the top of it. And that seems to be the priority, and not so much caring for children here once they arrive. Like, the anti-abortion movement has not spent its resources arguing for universal health care.
Yeah, so pro-life in certain ways and definitely not in others.
Right.
Yeah. You write about the role of conservative evangelicals in issues like LGBTQ+ rights, in gun control. I was particularly taken when you talked about the gun becoming almost kind of a god for some folks on the right. Can you talk about how the role of conservative evangelicals is similar and different when it comes to those issues as opposed to when it comes to abortion?
I would say the overarching theme, for lack of a better word, is this commitment to a hierarchy, and the gun is a way to enforce that hierarchy. Violence is a way to enforce that hierarchy. I recently interviewed a pair of academics, Phil Gorski and Samuel Perry, who made a similar argument based on their own research and in a new book about white Christian nationalism. And it is about power, and violence is a way of maintaining that power, of affirming that power. And the anti-abortion movement has had its own history with explicit acts of violence, but I would argue too that taking the right to an abortion away from a woman, forcing her to remain pregnant, is itself an act of violence as well. So I see them as being related in that way. As for LGBTQ plus rights, Thomas and his concurrence to Dobbs made it very clear that Obergefell is not safe. The right to marriage equality is not safe. The right to privacy itself is not safe. And that's not unique to Justice Thomas. I think that's, you can see it in the trans panic, you can see it in the Don't Say Gay bill down in Florida, you can see it in the hysteria over drag queen story hour or LGBT literature in libraries and public schools. They're all prongs of the same movement and the same fight.
I think you talked about in your movement away from conservative evangelicalism that you realized pretty early on that your liberation as a woman was bound up in the liberation of trans people. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that, and what about what is so threatening to conservative evangelicals about trans individuals in particular?
Yeah. So it goes back actually to my first semester at this as extremely conservative Christian college, where it was obviously not acceptable to be LGBTQ or even to be an ally or comrade to that community. You had to be very, very careful, very, very secretive in either case. But there was a group called Soul Force that at the time was going around to service academies and to Christian colleges like my own to protest these policies on campus. And many Christian colleges turned them away, refused to let them onto campus, but mine actually allowed them onto campus in a very controlled way, but did allow them to come and have some speech, like some lectures, and assign them kind of student guides. And I was one of those student guides, and that was in this scenario I met the very first openly trans person that I had ever met. And that experience of meeting a trans person, realizing they're just a person like me, was incredibly formative. My views on LGBTQ people did not survive unchanged from that encounter. And it did occur at this time when I was still very young, but I was thinking about my own place in the world. And this college had a very particular message for me as a woman. We couldn't preach, we couldn't have any form of spiritual authority in the church, which I found incredibly damaging and painful on a personal level. And it was expected, of course, that if you get married, you're supposed to be submissive to your husband. And these things seemed related to me. It was the same gender belief, essentially. And I think what they really feared about trans people is that they sort of defy these tropes about gender. They subvert gender in that way. And it's harder to fit them into that hierarchy that they want to maintain. So that's how I saw them as being connected at the time. It's still how I see them being connected. I see misogyny as the root of so much of it. And I think that's why they're so afraid of trans people in particular. It's what they signify about our performance of gender.
So essentially, women's rights, abortion, LGBTQ plus people challenge the dominance of cisgender, heterosexual
Absolutely.
men. And maybe we can even add white to that, given
Yes.
the role of white Christian nationalism.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm wondering if you feel comfortable talking a little bit about where you are religiously today. I know you wrote a piece about COVID almost brought you back to church,
Right.
but it didn't quite bring you back to church. And that struck me as a person in a progressive Christian context. Not all Episcopalians would use the word progressive, but many, especially here, would. What is the progressive church not doing in order to reach folks like you? We're trying to be a place that's for women's rights, that's for LGBTQ plus rights, and it doesn't always seem to stick with folks who are looking for that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I consider myself an atheist now, which is kind of a bittersweet thing to say. I do that sense of believing in something ineffable and in the supernatural and having that relationship with God is something that you give up when you move away from the church, and that is a loss. And I think I can say I'm an atheist, but like live with that loss at the same time. It's not necessarily. I think you have to make your peace with that. As for what the church can do, for people like me, the church was a site of, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say trauma. It was really a difficult and complicated relationship for me for many years. At the same time, I found a great church when I was in college. It was very small, but very committed to like working with unhoused people. There was like not the traditional hierarchy. We did use a liturgy, but people took turns giving homilies and things like that. And sometimes they were women, which was radical to me at the time. And I did find a kind of family there. It just wasn't a spiritual family for me. And I realized if I didn't believe in God there, I just probably didn't believe in God anymore. So I would say for someone who's kind of reached that point, it's hard for the progressive church to like reach them. But I think what it does do is sort of recast the church where it's no longer purely this site of trauma. Like it was very easy for me to walk in here today and come and speak with you all, and I've been looking forward to it for some time. And that's growth for me. And I'm grateful for that. So I think, to use an evangelical term, I think the progressive church has an important witness in the world, and that's going to continue to be the case. If you look at polling about younger generations in particular, where they're at, it is more common for people to identify as atheists than it used to be, but most people who describe themselves as sort of nuns, so people who aren't religiously affiliated, they're still spiritual. I think they're still seeking, and they're still looking for God, for answers in their lives, and I think the progressive church will be there for them.
What strikes me in your story and the story of so many others is that when the trauma started first and you questioned God as a result of that later, it didn't start with questions about God, and that to me is just an important statement about where the church fails in terms of if part of our job is to uphold belief in God when we are hurting others simply because of who they are, we, without intending to, we're also, causing belief in God to slip.
Right, and I think evangelicals will have to reckon with that at some point. I don't see it on the horizon anytime soon, but I do think it's going to become more and more of a challenge for them, and to retain younger people, and to, I see them as moving away from the very meaning of the term evangelical, which implies that you're going to have this witness to the world and you're going to bring people in. That implies a certain openness that just isn't there right now.
You talked about people who changed their minds on abortion. Did any of those folks stay in conservative evangelical context, even though their minds on this particular issue changed? Do you have a sense of pro-choice conservative evangelicals who are out there? Is that a population that exists?
It's an interesting question. So the people that I spoke to, many of them retained a belief in God and would consider themselves Christian, but not in the same way. Would not consider themselves conservative evangelicals at this point. As for pro-choice conservative evangelicals, I mean, I imagine if they exist, they probably do look something like my parents, who were not supporters of Donald Trump, to their credit, and have generally supported exceptions for rape and incest, which, like I said earlier, tends to put them outside the GOP on the subject at this point. So not quite correct to call them pro-choice, but there's a certain flexibility there that isn't present, and I think the core of the anti-abortion movement at this point. As for like how common that is, I think it's hard to say, but evangelicals are the least pro-choice demographic if you look at the polling, but it's not universal. I think there are exceptions.
Well, and what's fascinating about the Roman Catholic Church is the official position of the church is extremely pro-life, but the rank and file are much more divided on that than, say, conservative evangelicals. Even though it was really for a while, even up to Roe versus Wade, it was the Catholics leading the charge rather than the evangelicals, and then the evangelicals kind of took over at a certain point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Southern Baptist Convention was not always anti-abortion, which blew my mind when I first read about it, because I had grown up in such a uniformly anti-abortion setting. But it is interesting, that fact about the Catholic Church, and I've often wondered why that is.
It's true also on LGBTQ rights and
Yeah.
a whole host of other issues.
Yeah, and I've wondered if maybe that's the influence, maybe Catholic social teaching having an influence that maybe the leadership of the church didn't necessarily intend.
So we're over halfway, and we have the opportunity for you all to submit your questions to Sarah. You can do that using the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook. You can also email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. And if you're here in the room, we have some cards here in the center, and also Conrad Tinney, one of our ushers, has cards that you can fill out and submit to him in that basket, and he'll bring them up to me. So we do encourage you to send your questions and comments. While we're waiting for those, as someone who's written a lot on this issue, I know you were also, I think, in the streets after the Dobbs ruling talking to protesters. What do you think is next, both for the pro-choice and pro-life movements after Dobbs?
Yeah, so I've been to a couple of protests, most recently a counter-protest that was organized by NYC for abortion rights in Soho. And they had a pretty overwhelming crowd, like more people than they usually had. And that's a counter-protest, so they were in front of a Catholic church where they lead a processional down to a nearby clinic and pray in front of the clinic. And in a very ostentatious, in my view, kind of way. People were angry when I talked to them. They were incredibly angry on the pro-choice side, not just angry at anti-abortion activists and the movement that they represent, but angry with the Democratic Party, feeling like the president hadn't been proactive enough, feeling like Democratic leadership hadn't been proactive enough. People would point out that we knew this was coming for some time, not just meaning the leak, but like if you follow the anti-abortion movement, you've known that this has been in the works for decades. So there's a lot of frustration and a lot of anger, and I don't know where that energy is gonna go. There's not a natural outlet for it. People are so frustrated with the party that I'm not convinced that it's necessarily going to be mobilizing people to vote in the way that the president has urged people to do so. I think people are wondering what they're voting for. As for the anti-abortion movement, to use an old idiom, I think it's the case of the dog that caught the garbage truck. Like, they've got it, but now they have to figure out kind of where to go from here. And I think where they go from here is actually much clearer than it is for the pro-choice movement. I think they're going to go for a national abortion ban, and that'll be the next goal for them.
Yeah, I heard, I don't remember the name of the activist, but on the Daily this week, he was basically said that was his goal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what they've been working up to, so.
And there's a fear of prosecution in states that are that have already banned abortion or had the laws on books that it would happen after a ruling like Dobbs. And companies are trying to pay for expenses for some of their employees, but there's even kind of a backlash to that. Can you talk about this fear of those who, quote unquote, aid and abet being prosecuted?
Yeah, that's a very real fear that people have, and I think they're right to be afraid and worried about it. I mean, the anti-abortion movement never just consisted of people who are aggressive outside clinics, right? Like, there's a conservative legal movement that's attached to it, and they've been prepared for this for a long time. And I don't know that there's necessarily a corresponding force on the left. Like, there are organizations that exist. There are attorneys who I'm sure would offer services pro bono, but it's going to be a very difficult next few months and years, I think, for a lot of people. And I don't blame anyone for being afraid of prosecution.
And it's even true that in states where abortion is still legal, they could be impacted by the demand from other folks traveling from other states.
Yes, that's correct. So, I mean, there was a particularly prominent example recently that the president actually mentioned during his speech when he signed the executive order on abortion rights, where a 10-year-old rape victim in Ohio had to travel to Indiana for an abortion. And I think you're gonna see a lot of cases like that. And I think New York, the state of New York in particular, has an important role to play in the coming months and years as hopefully as a sanctuary for people who are seeking abortion services.
I'm sure there are some folks, I haven't seen the questions yet, but I'm sure there are some folks who are wondering, what can I do for the pro-choice cause? Any recommendations, suggestions?
Yeah, I don't have all the answers, but I think this is a time to allow yourself to feel angry, first of all. Anger can be constructive if you channel it in the right way. And I think that means putting pressure on elected officials. I think that means turning out for rallies and protests, like showing up when it's time to show up. If you have the means, donating to abortion funds is incredibly important, including even in states where abortion is legal. As we discussed, a lot of people are going to be traveling to those states for abortion services, and they're going to need help and they're going to need support. So I think there's a lot of different avenues.
All right, so we'll try to get all these questions in. If words like tragedy and shame are not helpful when talking about abortion, what is the rhetoric that pro-choice folks should use?
I think we should be talking, I like the word liberation. I use it a lot in my writing. I don't know if that's a holdover from my religious days, but it's probably more because I'm on the left. But I think we need to be talking more in those terms of like what it means to be liberated, what it means to be free, and how abortion is integral to freedom and to liberty and to liberation. I don't think those are words that we can necessarily cede to the right. So I would say that we need to like sort of reattach that to the subject of abortion.
Freedom and liberation specifically.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about how there are some anti-abortion activists who are also for universal health care. But for the most part, those anti-abortion folks aren't for helping the poor and feeding the hungry, at least in some organized way, or caring for other kinds of vulnerable populations like LGBTQ plus people or immigrants, et cetera. How do they make sense of that in themselves? The argument is we're caring about the most vulnerable, a baby that has not yet been born, and yet they're not willing to go out on a limb for other kinds of vulnerable populations. How do you explain that cognitive dissonance?
That's a tough one. It never made sense to me, even when I was a conservative evangelical, and I think that's why I began turning to the left before I left the church even, because it didn't make sense to me. But what I think you're seeing are the consequences of evangelicalism's marriage to the Republican Party, which is very old and has had a lot of consequences, and I think has sort of produced that cognitive dissonance where people can be anti-abortion because the fetus is a vulnerable person and yet support the death penalty, for example. I think it's just a result of Christianity becoming incredibly politicized in the U.S.
So we're using theological concepts as arguments rather than our motivating factors.
Right. Yeah.
State regulations are different from state to state. How many states are now banning procedures that are due to miscarriages and ectopic pregnancies where there's no chance of the fetus's survival? The fetus is not going to survive anyway.
I'm not aware of any specific law or regulation. I've just heard there are just anecdotal reports of women being turned away because the fetus still has a heartbeat and come back. When you're running a fever, for example, and an infection has set in. I'm concerned that we're going to see regulations have that unintended effect of women not getting prompt treatment for an ectopic pregnancy or a miscarriage. But I don't know that there's a regulation against it.
And are there any states of which you're aware and with which the life of the mother is not an exception to the abortion ban?
Not that I'm aware of, no. Yeah.
Let's see here. Evangelicals claim to speak for all Christians. Mm-hmm. What can Christians who are not conservative evangelicals do about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think people of faith have always been incredibly important partners in the struggle for abortion rights, not just for abortion rights, but for civil rights for Black Americans, in the struggle for humane immigration reform and LGBTQ rights. And that witness is going to be incredibly important in the years to come. And I think it is vital for people to speak out and say, I'm a person of faith, I believe in God, I'm a Christian, but this is not what I personally believe. And to be vocal about that and to really assert yourself is very important.
Pro-life activists talk about anti-abortion activists talk about the responsibility a woman has toward her unborn child. Mm. Is there any place for that discussion on the pro-choice side? What responsibilities might women have, or both parents have, towards a child who's not yet born?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I don't personally believe that a woman has any responsibility towards a fetus, but that's just based on my personal conviction that the fetus is not a person, and so we don't have a responsibility in the same way that I would say we have a responsibility to each other, that everyone in this room has a responsibility to everyone else in this room. So I'm not sure I would agree that it necessarily has a place, but the idea of responsibility, I think we can think about it in terms of the fact that, for example, most women who get abortions in the U.S. are already mothers. They're thinking about the responsibility they have to the children who are already here, to their partners, to themselves. And that's one way we can think about it, I think.
We've seen a lot of energy over the past few years when it comes to Me Too, the women's rights marches that have happened. Why did all of that energy not prevent this from happening? Yeah,
I think the election of Donald Trump, I think, was radicalizing for a lot of people. To have a president who had been accused of sexual assault by, I forget how many women, it's a lot of women. was radicalizing, brought people out to the streets as well as it should. But I think that energy was not necessarily going to defeat such a well-funded, well-organized movement, even though it's a minoritarian movement. And I think that's really important to emphasize. This is not the anti-abortion movement does not represent the views of most Americans or most Christians even on this subject. And so we weren't necessarily fighting fire with fire, I would say. It was asymmetric warfare, which is really difficult. And, you know, I believe in the power of direct action and I believe in the power of protest, but I think protest on its own is not necessarily going to get us where we need to be.
Do you think some of this is also a backlash to the increased articulation of women's rights and progress in all sorts of these other areas?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, I think the anti-abortion movement itself, like what we think of as the modern Christian right, was very much rooted in a backlash not only to civil rights, but to the sexual revolution and to expanded rights for women and an expanded role for women in society, and then to the expansion of, you know, LGBTQ rights and to more visible roles for LGBTQ people in society. So it's rooted in backlash. It's a reactionary movement. And I think, you know, Me Too was always going to generate kind of this following backlash itself. So I think that's absolutely what's going on.
So we're pretty much at the end of our time. I'll try to end us on a note of hope. Where do you have hope in this moment?
It's going to sound a little cliche, but I have hope in people. Like I do believe, I think we will be victorious in the end. Like I have to believe that as a person who's on the left. Otherwise, what's the point of any of it? Of being a progressive person, of believing in rights for women and for LGBTQ people, for Black Americans. Like you have to believe that someday you're going to be successful. That's the whole point. It's just going to take time. It's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of passion and commitment, but I do think we can get there.
Well, Sarah, I'm so glad that you decided to come back to church, which hasn't always been a fun place for you, and have this conversation with us this morning.
Thanks you so
for being
much.
here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
And thank you all for being here too, whether you're joining us in person or online. We hope you'll stick around and join us for worship at 11 a.m. And then next week at the Forum, we'll be talking to Zachary Fletcher, who's a hospital chaplain who has worked in the realm of autism and neurodiversity, who will talk about new ways of looking at autism and all forms of neurodiversity. So hope to see you next week at the Forum at 10 a.m. Thanks again for being here. Thank you so much, Sarah.